If there's one thing that's always welcome in wrestling, one sort of guy you always really want to see, for me it's got to be the brutal, ruthless and agile heavyweight. The gold standard of ridiculous absolute units, the one that's well over £300 but then does things that shock and amaze you, the burly brawler who doesn't have to look like they're chiselled out of rock, but they still look like they'd tear crowds of people asunder. You know, that sort of wrestler. Back in the 80s and 90s there were plenty of awesome examples. Vader, Bam Bam Bigelow, Big Boss Man, Aja Khan, Terry Gordy, the Headhunters, those guys. In between the glory days and the Renaissance, however, the 2000s and so on, such wrestlers weren't necessarily fashionable. The WWE didn't particularly want them, and you didn't really see them too much in the big indies. But there were a couple of folks you could always count on to deliver. Samoa Joe was one, of course, Awesome Khan was another, you had Umaga in WWE at least. But then there's this fella. This man was a constant threat, a fast-moving chunk of beef who could be as dominant as anyone I've just mentioned and had the titles to prove it. And in the times when the indies were dominated by speedy and technical juniors, he came across the pond to smash people directly in the face and win even more belts. He was the Japanese monster. He was Noah's Takeshi Morishima. At once both an unashamed throwback and a glimpse of the future, Morishima was basically the last word in burly brawlers in the mid-late 2000s. It is kind of sad to have to talk about Morishima in the past tense. Now I should mention from the outset that this is not because he's dead. He's just not in the business anymore, despite only being 41 years of age at the time of writing this. In an ideal world, Morishima would still very much be around and relevant in Japanese wrestling, at the very least. Even if not active in the ring, then certainly connected in some way. But things haven't worked out like that, and we'll be looking at just what happened. We'll also be taking a general look at his career. While we won't be looking at every great Morishima match in detail or anything, we'll see how he came to prominence, his incredible run in Ring of Honor, how he almost ended up on the biggest American stage, and other highlights of his career in Noah. Let's do this. This is Takeshi Morishima. One thing to note about Japanese wrestlers is that, in many cases, we don't know an awful lot about their younger years. Information is hard to come by and usually depends purely on what the wrestler will choose to tell you. Those who are athletic tend to be perhaps a little more isolated than most other students. School sports is a big deal in Japan and a lot of times dedicated to it. When you then reach the age of 18 and apply to join a pro wrestling dojo, however, well, that's a whole other level. In fact, you pretty much disappear for a couple of years. You leave your parents' house and now you're living in the dojo. Everything in the dojo is utterly regimented. Most of your day is devoted entirely to intense training. If you aren't training, then you're performing chores and waiting on your elders. You'll get your square meals a day, of course, but you'll only probably spend an hour a week outside of the dojo, so long as you don't have any other things to do. And when outside the dojo, you must conduct yourself in an expected manner. No drinking, no relationships, no getting into fights, no socialising or anything like that. The punishments for breaching this, or even for the most minor lapses in etiquette or work, are severe. It's all very military and very, very intense. Most of those who enter the dojo system drop out quickly for the simple reason that it's far too much for any ordinary person to take. It's the way things have been done for many, many years. The pro wrestling dojo system in Japan is much like the sumo wrestling dojo system. The end product of the dojo system, for those who stick around and thrive in it, is ideally someone built for pro wrestling. They'll go on to become young lions, still with responsibilities but also with a bit more freedom. The best of them are often the ones sent on foreign excursions, sent to widen their skill set and teach what the dojo can't. And the best of those? Well, they become champions. Takeshi Morishima fits every last bit of this criteria. He did all of this and more. He was trained in the All Japan Dojo in the late 90s, made his debut in 1998 alongside other legends in the making such as Naomichi Marufuji, wrestled all over the world and won many accolades and championships inside and outside Japan. And yet a lot of the people who know him wouldn't necessarily say that he was a complete person. His only real interest was wrestling. This isn't uncommon. The sports and dojo systems do often result in a bit of arrested development and missing out on a lot of experiences most others would have. Genichiro Tenryu, one of the greatest to ever lace up a pair of boots and someone intimately familiar with both sumo and wrestling, has a great quote summarising this. "The inhabitants here are really bad at socialising because both sumo and pro wrestling are isolated from ordinary society. Like wrestlers, if you don't have the opportunity to have a family or be introduced to someone, you basically have little interaction with outsiders." Outside of wrestling, we know that Morishima was born in the Tokyo suburb of Edogawa and that his childhood wasn't necessarily a happy one. He didn't really have too many hobbies or interests outside of wrestling at all. Even at his most successful, he was basically content to spend his downtime sitting in his apartment and watching old movies. He has never married and, as far as anyone knows, has never had any kind of lasting relationship, nor has he ever tried to seek one out. He kept most things to himself and has never kept much beyond a small circle of close friends, but he is certainly gracious to those people. For most people, this perhaps just wouldn't be enough of a life, but even if Morishima is one of the more extreme cases, and we'll examine that more come the end of the video, a lot of wrestlers who grew up in the dojo system have trouble transitioning out of it, developing issues with socialising and struggling to make the most of their freedoms. Pretty much right from the moment that Morishima joined just about everyone else in All Japan for the big split to Noah in 2000, watchers of the company had pegged him as someone with potential. It was Misawa's desire to give the younger All Japan wrestlers more of a platform in Noah than they'd previously had in All Japan, and so Morishima, along with the likes of Marufuji, Kenta, Yoshinobu Kanemaru, Takeshi Rikioh and many others, was pretty well featured from the beginning. He would even have singles bouts with some of the big names. This sort of bout, often called a trial, is usually considered a big marker of just how much a company sees in a wrestler. Even if they're usually short and the younger wrestler loses almost every time, they'll get their chances to hand with a big dog. Such is the case for Morishima's bouts against Yoshihiro Takayama in 2001 and even against the almighty Vader in 2002. That match in particular is a great little 5-minute mega blast of violence, and it might just be the last really good Vader singles match. For most of the early 2000s, however, Morishima would generally be a tag specialist. Again, he would be teamed up with another highly thought of younger wrestler. His team with Takeshi Rikioh, Wild 2, would prove to be quite successful, earning him his first wrestling gold when they won the GHC tag titles in 2002. Later, in the mid-2000s, he won 2 more tag belts teaming with Muhammad Yone, and a 4th one in 2009 with Kensuke Sasaki. He's one of the most successful tag wrestlers in the company's history, that's for sure. The Morishima Rikioh team is certainly the most historically notable though. After all, both of these guys would end up becoming GHC heavyweight champions. Most notable of all, however, would be his first singles gold. This came in 2003. Oddly, it's not a Noah title. He ended up winning the heavyweight title of Harley Racer's World League Wrestling promotion, beating Juan Harris and holding it for several months. Harley Racer's dojo stroke promotion had a lengthy agreement with Noah that resulted in several of their guys coming over, particularly old indie staples like Mike Modest and Donovan Morgan, and Morishima winning the title was a part of that. Despite winning a US belt, he never actually defended it or came to the States at this point. This little reign did also produce, mind you, the best early Morishima singles match, an absolute must-see bout against Daisuke Aikida from 2004. In Daisuke Aikida, Morishima had a very suitable dance partner, a hard-hitting wrestler born out of the weird mix of puroresu and shoot style that was battle arts, more than happy to take Morishima's hardest shots and give them back with interest. The result is a fantastic strike fest that you absolutely ought to check out, and of course much better was to come. Gradually, Morishima's star continued to rise. Around this time, in 2005 to 2006, we were getting familiar with what he had to offer. Kinda like what Kurt Angle said about Rhino. We didn't know about integrity or intelligence, but intensity. Morishima had it in spades. So incredibly vocal and fiery in the ring, lots of good old-fashioned stiff strikes and wrestling, while also being surprisingly agile for his size. People loved him for a lot of the reasons that they loved Samoa Joe. The two were compared quite a lot at the time, no small deal considering that Joe was thought of as one of the very best around. Still, Noah weren't going to rush Takeshi Morishima. They had rushed his old tag partner Takeshi Rikioh more than a fair bit, and that hadn't really worked out. While most of this time is still spent in his aforementioned successful tag team with Muhammad Yone, in March 2006 Morishima takes on Mitsuharu Misawa in what was easily his biggest singles bout to date. While he expectedly comes out on the losing side, he still lasts over 15 minutes against the Emerald Legend. Not long after this, he takes his first brief excursion to the UK, wrestling in all sorts of promotions and even winning another title. You can find him in this brief period taking on even more stars of the future. If you ever wanted to see Morishima take on both Puck and Kevin Steen in a four-way, then this is the only place to do it. But all of this lays the groundwork for what's to come. One of the most notable foreign excursions of them all, Takeshi Morishima's trip to Ring of Honor. As I mentioned not long ago, Takeshi Morishima and Samoa Joe were compared to each other pretty often. People really wanted to see them take each other on. The cool thing, of course, was that it was hardly a pipe dream. Noah and ROH had a working relationship, after all, one that truly kicked off on that incredible night when Joe faced Kenta Kobashi. But perhaps more important than that, and more sustained, was Kenta's lengthier one in Ring of Honor. He was one of the stars of the promotion in 2006, featuring in no end of incredible singles matches against the likes of Low Ki, Davey Richards, Austin Aries, Roderick Strong. He was awesome. His biggest weekend in ROH came on the 15th and 16th of September 2006 at their flagship show, the Glory by Honor weekend. Having beaten the Briscoes on night 1 with Marufuji in a dream tag match, night 2 saw him take on ROH champion Bryan Danielson. If you were watching ROH in 2006, you know that Danielson was kin, and that his title reign was legitimately one of the freaking greatest ever. Kenta was the biggest threat to his title yet, and a lot of people thought the Japanese star was going to do the unprecedented and win. Ultimately, after what can only be described as an absolute classic, Danielson triumphed. This main event on an incredible card certainly produced a hell of a lot of talk, but just as many people were talking about something that happened earlier on in the night. With this being one of the biggest nights in ROH history so far, 1200 in the Manhattan Center, there would be special guests through the night, with the biggest of all being the living legend himself, Bruno Sammartino. Few people would be more fitting to be there. This is the man who basically built wrestling in New York, after all. He comes out after the first match, gives a speech and thanks to a very welcoming crowd, and then shakes the hand of all the wrestlers around the ring, including Morishima, Muhammad Yone and Takashi Sugiura, who are here to act as seconds for Naomichi Marufuji in his GHC heavyweight title defence later on against Nigel McGuinness. As the wrestlers file out on both sides, whose paths would cross but those of Morishima and Samoa Joe. It's all respectful at first. After you! No, after you. Oh, no, I insist. And then the pushing starts. And then the punching starts. The two enter the ring for a massive pull-apart brawl while the Manhattan Center becomes absolutely unglued. Still probably one of the most insane pops in the history of Ring of Honor. What an awesome angle. And it sets up what's to happen in the months ahead when Morishima makes his way back to the company. 2007 was arguably Morishima's signature year, the one most people really remember him for. Weirdly, most of it happened outside of his main company, in fact, outside of Japan. His run in Ring of Honor was something else, with almost every big-name wrestler in the company united to try and stop someone who was looking to be the most dominant force in ROH history, even more dominant than Samoa Joe had been a couple of years previous. Indeed, that's where things would start. Joe would take on Morishima, as expected, with the result being as you would expect. A total war. They certainly didn't disappoint in the match, a fitting one for ROH's first show in their 5th year festival series. But in the end, the home team won a good fight that still left the expectation for something more to come from the pair. On the very next night in Philadelphia, Morishima faced Homicide for the ROH World title. Homicide had beaten Danielson for the title in an emotional victory for the company mainstay at the end of 2006, and people didn't necessarily expect him to lose the title so soon. It's a brilliant match, one where Homicide throws everything at the Japanese monster. Big flips, strong strikes, illegal moves, Julius Smoke's interference, even foul language. but in the end it's just not enough. Morishima overcomes all of it, and after 15 minutes, a couple of devastating backdrop drivers are enough to put Homicide down. Morishima, bloody nose and all, has gone one step further than Kenta did. He is now the ROH champion. And there will be no title ceremony. He immediately blasts all seconds that have come to Lewin to congratulate him, immediately establishing himself as lead dominant heel invader. While Homicide vs Morishima would always have been something of a David vs Goliath battle, it still came as a big surprise. Morishima wasn't fully established in American fans' minds the way that Kenta was, for example, and having spent so freaking long trying to win the title, people did expect Homicide's reign to last a bit longer than just 2 months. So why Morishima? Obviously there's the big surprise of it all. It certainly helped solidify ROH's relationship with Noah, which was blossoming. There's another big reason perhaps though, lying behind the scenes. After 5 years of highly acclaimed shows on DVD, ROH were looking to take a step further, towards their first pay-per-view as well as video on demand. Soon it would be announced that Respect is Earned on May the 12th would be shown later as their first PPV. It's something that people had expected for a long time. Still, such a move would come with consequences. ROH had previously had a working agreement with TNA, very much the number 2 US company at the time, allowing them to use wrestlers under TNA contract as they saw fit, mostly the people who'd come up in or were very frequently in ROH, like Samoa Joe, Homicide, Christopher Daniels, AJ Styles and so on. A big chunk of ROH's main event scene. ROH's step towards expansion was always going to be seen by TNA as the company becoming more of a threat than a partner, and there would inevitably be a pushback. ROH kind of expected it and had gradually pushed their wrestlers that were under TNA contract away from the main event storylines to soften the blow. And indeed, the day after ROH's pay-per-view announcement, TNA announced that they were pulling all of their talent from future ROH shows on April 24th. No more Joe, no more Homicide and so on. Unfortunately, this means that the February meeting between Joe and Morishima would be their only singles bout. There'd have certainly been more with the title on the line if the pullout hadn't happened, but there you go. It would perhaps be silly to go through every single Morishima ROH title defence. The ROH Championship was defended a lot in those days, and even despite Noah commitments, Morishima was no exception. Over the course of a 231-day reign with the belt, Morishima defended the title no less than 21 times, and most of those defences were in the States. We can't really hit all of them, but we can certainly hit some of the best ones. What can be said is that every major ROH champion brings a certain style to the belt, a blueprint that you can expect from their matches. It's not necessarily a single style. Samoa Joe's trademark perhaps was that he could do just about anything, from a short and vicious brawl to a more technical bout, and even an epic Broadway. Bryan Danielson was the absolute master of technique in his reign, quite a few Broadways and generally a lot of long and highly engrossing technical bouts, packed full of storytelling. Morishima was his opposite. His title defences were certainly shorter, usually in and around the 15-minute range, and packed with violence, with Morishima as the dominant power heel, basically always outweighing his opponents. Sometimes his defences would be more showcase than match, as he clearly dominated someone who simply couldn't hang with him, but there was plenty of room for magic, especially against the two opponents you'd have probably expected it the most from, Danielson and ROH's other technical wizard, Nigel McGuinness. When Morishima went against either Danielson or McGuinness, holy hell. While there'd be plenty of fine short defences against folks like Jay Briscoe, Austin Aries and Roderick Strong, these were quite simply perfect pairings. Morishima's smash-mouth brawling was the perfect complement to the speedy technique possessed by McGuinness and Danielson. It's kind of annoying in a way because really, I don't want to say an awful lot about the matches. You need to check them out for yourself. It became pretty clear that one of them would eventually be the one to take Morishima out, seemingly getting closer and closer each time, and Morishima McGuinness would even headline ROH's first Japanese show in Tokyo in another great match. But if you have to pick just one match to watch from Morishima's ROH reign, hell, if you had to pick one to watch from his entire career, there's really no contest. It has to be Manhattan Mayhem 2 on August 25th, 2007. The first meeting between Morishima and Danielson would be 2007's match of the year. Again, I just don't want to say too much, really. This is one of those matches that you need to watch for yourself if you haven't, and I really would not want to spoil that for someone who's never watched this absolute classic. What I will say is that in the very first brutal exchanges of this match, the pair got so stiff with each other that Danielson's retina got detached. And despite this injury, the match kept going and just got even more savage for 20 minutes of sheer hell in one of the great wrestling venues in front of an absolutely molten audience. It got 4 3/4 stars in the Observer, and really it should have gotten 5. While Bryan Danielson is absolutely one of the greatest to ever do it, and this is one of his most incredible showcases, his pitch-perfect evolution of the classic David vs Goliath formula, Morishima is absolutely red hot as well. This match could not have happened with anyone else. So yeah, just watch this match. Now. It wouldn't be the only classic, of course. Morishima vs McGuinness? Just as good, really. And in another tremendous match on the 6th of October, McGuinness would finally be the one to dethrone Morishima, an apocalyptic jawbreaker lariat being enough to put him down for the 3 count. McGuinness himself would go on to another one of Ring of Honor's great reigns, and there's no doubt that the reign of Morishima helped the company get through some tricky times with the loss of TNA talent and all of that. This was back in the glory days when the company was basically the best thing to watch out there, and he was a big part of that. After losing the belt, he would come back to Ring of Honor a few more times, with his last match taking place at Final Battle 2008, a fight without honour against, naturally, Bryan Danielson. Obviously the result was, again, as you would expect. Danielson finally defeated Morishima in the match, putting an end to their incredible rivalry. And indeed, an end to Morishima's time in the company. It would also stand him in pretty good stead for his return to full-time wrestling in Noah. After Morishima's Ring of Honor run, it seemed inevitable that sooner or later he would become GHC Heavyweight Champion. He'd certainly proved himself more than worthy of the top spot. And indeed it wouldn't take too long. While he couldn't beat Mitsuharu Misawa for the title at the first time of asking, he would on the second in events that we've largely already covered in my video all about Misawa's final big heavyweight title reign. In short, after a long time where Misawa felt he had to take the reins as champion despite a breaking down body because no one was established enough to hold the belt at the time, Morishima was finally chosen as the guy, defeating Misawa in a thoroughly excellent match. On March 2nd, Morishima became GHC Heavyweight Champion. Clearly he was going to be the big star now, finally someone that would truly fit into the long-term boots of a Misawa or a Kobashi. So as we also covered a little in the Misawa video, things didn't fully work out that way. It's not as if Morishima had a terrible reign or anything, but in the 188 days he held the belt he only made 2 successful defences, one against Takashi Sugiura, on his own path towards the top, and another against ex-partner Takeshi Rikioh, who was definitely on the way down by now. It wasn't exactly action-packed compared to his Ring of Honor reign, that's for sure. And then, on the 6th of September 2008, he dropped the belt to another very much established old-time big star who'd just declared his intention to wrestle for Noah full-time, Kensuke Sasaki. Back in the Misawa video I speculated on the reasons for this. One obvious one, which had to have been a factor, was the credit crunch and global recession. This certainly had a big effect on Japanese wrestling companies, and in fact the recession would ultimately be the main reason why Noah lost their deal with Nippon TV, ending a decades-long relationship between the channel and puroresu. In times like this you do kinda go for established big names. However, looking at other events surrounding Morishima at the time, I reckon there may be another possible reason. Since 2006 at the very earliest, there had been rumours of WWE having a possible interest in signing Takeshi Morishima. It's known that WWE had tried to organise a meeting with Morishima in 2006 when he was briefly in America training at Harley Race's aforementioned WOW promotion, and later in August 2007 they tried to organise another meeting after a Ring of Honor show in New York. The meeting never happened both times because Noah vetoed it, adamantly declaring that Morishima was not for trading. It's also quite clear who the main man was behind these attempts at getting Morishima. The old VP of Talent Relations himself, John Laurinaitis. Now of course no one has much good to say about old Johnny as a member of WWE staff. You know, Diva Search, bra and panties and all that other shit. Still, it's hardly surprising he'd be manning a drive for Morishima. His greatest success as a wrestler did come in 90s All Japan after all, meaning he naturally had lasting connections with the folks at Noah. He was most certainly a fan of Takeshi Morishima, that much is definitely known. This whole thing stewed for a while as the Cosmic Ballet continued to march on, until coming back in a big way with the news in August 2008 that prior to the August 18th and 19th Raw and SmackDown shows, Takeshi Morishima had wrestled 2 dark match tryouts against Charlie Haas and Jamie Noble, reigniting all the rumours of his possible signing and being particularly shocking seeing as he was still GHC Heavyweight Champion at the time. You may wonder how the hell it happened as a result, and the answer is that it kinda took a hell of a lot of negotiation between WWE and Noah, with Harley Race kind of acting as the middleman, to get him into that ring at all. Noah's stance was that they weren't totally against Morishima going to WWE in principle, but that he was still going to basically be their guy. Their main aim would have been to get Morishima more exposure in America so that he can then go back to Noah with added notoriety and as an even bigger draw. There would have to be an understanding between Noah and WWE that Morishima would not be made to look weak during his time there. Irregardless of anything, this was always going to be a big stumbling block in negotiations. Simply put, the WWE generally does not work this way at all, preferring wrestlers to be fully under their control. With this in mind, the prospects of the deal happening already looked quite remote on paper. However, that wasn't the ultimate reason why the deal was nixed. The reason for that, in fact, was that the WWE were apparently unimpressed with Morishima's tryouts when he got there. We don't have access to much of anything beyond a few fan-shot seconds of his bout with Haas, so we can't really comment, but apparently officials didn't care much for his performance and were not impressed with his physique, considering it to be almost disrespectful. This bit seems odd. Morishima is, after all, burly. That's kinda his gimmick. Was it any more than usual? Or was it just more of an issue because he didn't necessarily put in a good performance? Jim Ross, on his Ross Report, did write a little about his own thoughts on Morishima's performance, saying the following: "I haven't heard a word about how well his matches went. I watched his match in Moline and it was okay. Not bad, not great. It looks like Morishima might want to focus on his athletic conditioning and hit the gym more frequently. I am not being negative here, only realistic. Morishima has something that seems like it might be worth exploring. I like his timing and there is no doubt potential with this young man." To me, the tone here strikes me as being diplomatic more than anything. You get the feeling that there's a bit more under the surface. Beyond the dirt sheets reporting that WWE officials weren't too impressed, there was nothing more. These dark matches were the end of WWE's near 2-year-long interest in Morishima. The man himself didn't have too much to say about the experience aside from saying he learnt some moves from Ricky Steamboat that he intended to use in his upcoming match with Kensuke Sasaki, which he of course then went on to lose. And I do kind of wonder if that title loss against Sasaki represented some sort of punishment. If Morishima looked bad on a WWE stage, then naturally the thought would be that he made Noah look bad by extension. There's no way of confirming this, of course. The Japanese world of wrestling is much more insular than the Western world, there's no real equivalent to dirt sheets as such, and therefore the rumours don't get out as easily. But the timing does certainly add up. It is a bit surprising that Noah would go to all this effort to clearly be behind Morishima to the point of having an interest in sending him to the WWE as a way of trying to make him a massive draw, to then just having him drop the strap almost as soon as he returned. Perhaps there's something in this, perhaps not. But that's the story, all told. Of course, if that was the case, it was only a punishment, not a major demotion. Morishima would still enjoy plenty of success in the years to come. By this time he was certainly complete as a package, gimmick and all. He had the throwback aura, particularly with his entrance costume and cowboy hat, that kinda positioned him as the Japanese bastard son of Terry Bam Bam Gordy. He still had the sick moves, the crushing lariat, the amazing impact inverted chokeslam, the deadly backdrop driver, and he still had plenty of skill. There'd be a lot of main event matches to come. He would continue to play a big part in Noah both inside and outside of the ring. He'd take on a lot more responsibilities in the office following the tragic death of Mitsuharu Misawa in 2009. There were also stables such as Brave and Chokibu Gun, the latter of which was formed in 2014 with Morishima as leader following a heel turn. The monster would continue to be a constant feature in Noah's cards. Still, after about 2009 or so, Morishima's matches do plateau at a certain very good level, still very much an attraction, although he stops being noticed by Western fans as much. Mind you, a lot of that is to do with Noah itself becoming far less high profile, with the company very much on the downturn in the early 2010s. He remained pretty much in the main event, or certainly on the outskirts of the main event of Noah right up until the end of his career, and he would go on to win the GHC Heavyweight Championship 2 more times. In fact, his second reign would last just over a year, most certainly giving him that proper reign of sorts with the belt, where he defended the title against most of the other stars, folks like Naomichi Marufuji, Jun Akiyama and Go Shiozaki, before finally dropping the belt to Kenta. This was in 2013, and if you're still hungry for more Morishima action, you may definitely want to check some of these matches out. Still, this lengthy reign didn't do an awful lot to increase his profile, because the company at the time was in freefall, reeling from a massive Yakuza scandal that could have easily killed them, and also dealing with the huge negative reaction from their treatment of Kenta Kobashi that almost saw the legend kicked out the door with barely a fanfare, and resulted in the departure of many familiar and very popular names. Also, perhaps annoyingly for Morishima, he was never truly considered the ace during his run. Ask most people who that was and they would have probably said Kenta instead of the reigning champion. Such was the company booking back then. His third reign was brief and more of a transitory one, although it could again have been more. He turned heel, defeated Kenta again for the belt, and then dropped it after a little over a month to New Japan Pro Wrestling's Yuji Nagata. It seems on the surface like a quick passing, but again there is a bit more to it. When he beat Kenta in January 2014, the rumours had already started flying about Kenta's inevitable departure to WWE, so the ace was now leaving. With Morishima defeating him, it looked like a big promotion of sorts, perhaps not to the level of company ace because his body was beginning to get the better of him, but certainly higher. But then came the deal with New Japan that saw Nagata and many others come over for a big invasion storyline, and there went Morishima's reign. While the company's profile was raised in the short term by this invasion, it ultimately worked out terribly for them. By the time it abruptly ended with the pull-in of all New Japan wrestlers, almost every homegrown Noah star had been fully and decisively beaten over the course of a storyline that went way too frickin' long, and the company was again left at death's door. Antonio Inoki may no longer have been in charge at New Japan, but the result of a New Japan invasion storyline was still much the same as it would have been if he was still there. Now there's definitely worth to be found here, certainly lots of cool highlights and what have you, but I think Morishima did settle into a certain area, at least when it comes to Western Puro appreciation, where he certainly had his fans, but he wasn't really likely to gain too many more. He perhaps just lacked that little bit of versatility. As good as the general Morishima match is, you do get the feeling after watching a few of them that you've kind of seen all that he can do and he stops surprising you. Generally, there was always going to be more love for others on the roster, the folks like Kenta or Marufuji or Segura who were capable of a fair bit more, although Morishima was an excellent opponent for all three. And as we reach the latter part of his career, injuries also start to become a factor, with blows to the rotator cuff, left elbow, knees and feet becoming nagging problems. After the failed WWE tryout, and even despite his agreed upon burliness, his shape would often come into question, with people speculating about his general fitness levels, and it's pretty likely that said shape was a factor in his ever more frequent injuries. Still, there was more shocking news to come. On the 11th of April 2015, Morishima wrestled as part of his Chokibu Gun stable in a winning effort against The Mighty Don't Kneel and Super Crazy. On the 16th of April, it was announced that Morishima would be out for an indefinite period due to a recurrence of the rotator cuff injury and other issues that had previously put him out in 2013, with the hope that he'd be back in a couple of months. But shockingly, just a few days later, it was announced by Noah that on doctor's advice, Takeshi Morishima was retiring from the ring. The injuries were a factor, as Morishima had been struggling with them for years, but a blood test had also discovered a rise in his glycated hemoglobin values to abnormal levels, consistent with diabetes. Morishima announced the news on his Facebook page, apologising for worrying his fans. His retirement would be a quiet one. While it would be expected that a wrestler of Morishima's standing would get a ceremony, and one was indeed announced, it ended up being quietly cancelled, and in December of 2015, Morishima's contract with Noah expired, leaving him fully out of the business. In his words, he had only done professional wrestling for 18 years. He only had professional wrestling. And now, well, it's over. The main reason why Morishima didn't get a ceremony or retirement match was, as it turns out, largely down to himself. Naomichi Marufuji, by this time Noah's vice president, was willing to do whatever Morishima asked for his retirement. Although the two were not necessarily close friends or anything like that, they had known each other since they were trainees, and in Marufuji's words, he spent more time with Morishima than he had with his own family. But eventually, due to both worries about his condition and a high anxiety, Morishima himself cancelled his planned retirement match in Osaka, and indeed left without so much as a ceremony for an uncertain future. He had said to Marufuji in his more candid moments that losing wrestling to him was akin to losing a limb. For 3 years, everything basically went quiet, with Morishima having little to say anywhere. What he posted on social media was often seen to be a bit strange. He left the scene completely and fluttered between a whole lot of jobs. It didn't exactly have to be this way, of course. Many Japanese wrestlers, once they leave active competition, find continuing work in the industry, and someone of Morishima's status would have found a position very easily indeed. Why, he could have easily stayed in Noah's office, or he could have been a trainer, or all sorts. There were tons of opportunities. However, all this was something that Morishima, at first, flatly rejected. A lot of this had to do with sheer burnout and mental health issues that he recognised he was suffering from. Those 18 years in the business had certainly taken their toll physically, but mentally too. His retirement wasn't entirely to do with his diagnosis of diabetes. That didn't necessarily have to be the end for him, but in his words it had a lot to do with sheer mental burnout. He clearly felt it necessary to break off from wrestling completely, although as the long line of jobs suggests, he had a lot of trouble adjusting to regular citizen life. Not exactly surprising considering wrestling was virtually all Morishima had ever known. According to reports though, around early 2018 it did appear as though Morishima had started to find some sort of stability. He had begun to work in a care home, was holding the job down, and was actually working towards a medical care qualification. It was at this point that a local promotion asked him to do a bit of coaching on the side, with inevitable results. It all seems good on paper. After a couple of years out of the business, Morishima dips his toe into the water again, and in doing so he rekindles his passion and love for wrestling. Now recovered from mental and physical burnout, he abandons his plans for a medical qualification and begins training for the fairy tale return that will see the name of Takeshi Morishima grace the flyers, banners, and pages of Weekly Pro Wrestling once more. It's all just like a movie, isn't it? Said return would officially be confirmed when Morishima, slightly thinner, dark-haired and suited up, made an unannounced appearance at Riki Choshu's Power Hall show on July 10th. He spoke in a somewhat rambling but candid way about the issues that had led him to retire and what he'd been doing in his time out of wrestling, but then made the announcement that he would indeed be returning. The return would take place on October 15th at a show subtly titled Genesis, The Return of Takeshi Morishima, where he would take on then GHC heavyweight champion and old rival Takashi Sugiura. Following the announcement, Morishima apparently left the arena immediately in a cab. The announcement of Morishima's return naturally created a fair amount of hype in the IWC. Naturally, people were happy to see the guy back. Still, there were those people more in the know who sounded a fair few notes of caution. People who were a bit more familiar with Morishima's mental state did basically say, more or less, don't hold your breath when it came to the show actually happening. As mentioned, Morishima was somewhat rambling in his return speech and didn't appear all that confident in his words, averting his eyes from the audience often. He said the right things, sure, but it still appeared like it may be far too much and far too soon. One thing to get a kick out of doing a little training on the side, another to suddenly announce a big main event show and return. So some people gave long odds on the Genesis show actually happening. The big warning signs came when Morishima appeared at Flight, a Noah show commemorating Marufuji's 20th anniversary, on the 1st of September. His behaviour was very erratic. When on commentary he snubbed a fair amount of the action, referred to Kino by his shoot name, and spent most of the time pimping his own return show, causing a massive argument with Takashi Suguru as a result. He then did not show up to the after-show party, instead posting comments online to the effect of being not interested in Uchida's Noah, but only Misawa's Noah, referring to Masayuki Uchida, then president of the company. This, to date, appears to be Takeshi Morishima's final interaction with Pro Wrestling Noah. On the 10th of September, Morishima was rushed to hospital suffering from severe pain in his feet, later diagnosed as septic arthritis, and underwent surgery. Naturally, this resulted in the cancellation of his in-ring return, but while it was said that the event would be rescheduled for a later date, no second date would ever be announced. So, there goes the big return. It was sadly all too predictable for a lot of people. While the circumstances of the show's cancellation were unfortunate, some almost thought it perhaps a blessing, with Morishima perhaps reaching too far. However, the worst was yet to come. Late in the evening on the 4th of November, Takeshi Morishima was arrested and charged with violently assaulting a taxi driver, punching him in the face and breaking his cheekbones. Laid rowed over a fare, Morishima had been travelling in the cab for a lengthy period of time, and it soon became clear that Morishima did not have any money on him and was, in fact, looking for someone who would pay the fare for him, which by this stage was at 18,000 yen, or roughly £130. The driver stopped the taxi and demanded payment, and that was how the argument started. From this, the rather sad details of Takeshi Morishima's existence were revealed, and how erratic his behaviour had become, particularly since the cancellation of Genesis. Morishima had often spent most days in the very wrestling-centric district of Kabukicho in Tokyo, drinking and telling people how big of a star he was, usually in the hopes of being bought another drink. He got a reputation for being mean and belligerent as a drunk, and used to harass any wrestler he recognised for taxi money. He would even go to indie shows, watch them, and then try and borrow money from the young wrestlers in order to pay a waiting cab. Most troubling of all perhaps was that Morishima, at the time, was basically homeless. He'd been kicked out of his previous apartment and had no fixed abode, usually spending the night on the couches of people he'd met, or in restaurants where he worked as a living employee. The sad thing is, he was at least right about one thing: he had been a big star. On the night of his arrest, Morishima had visited the Stanley Bar, run by former wrestler Naoshi Sano, in order to borrow money. However, he wasn't in. After waiting for a while, he tried to shake down the on-duty manager, saying he'd be back later with friends, and then once again roamed the district in a taxi looking for anyone he recognised as a wrestler who could hopefully pay up the fare. This was not uncommon behaviour, unfortunately. A lot of people commented that they'd never seen him sober, and that he was usually in a terrible state because he didn't change his clothes. After reports of the assault, the reaction from the world of wrestling was one of total disappointment. People hoped that he would sort himself out for the good of both himself and society, but it never seemed that hopes were too high on that front. There's no real word on what came after the arrest, no record of a trial or sentence or anything. It was reported, or at least hinted at by Kino, that Morishima had been placed in a secure unit, somewhere where he could deal with issues. And as of November 2018, generally, that is the last the wrestling world has heard of Takeshi Morishima. A lot of the detail in this video comes from an article called Traces to Nowhere, the tragic story behind the Takeshi Morishima arrest, written by Hisame, translator of Noah articles and interviews and so much more, and one of the absolute best English sources around when it comes to the company. There's a link to the article in the description so you can read it for yourself. I asked Hisame if she knew anything further about the current state or whereabouts of Morishima, but alas, there's nothing. This story comes to an abrupt and very sad end. Now, there are a couple of very recent flecks of info on Takeshi Morishima that do hopefully point to him being in a better state of mind these days. He does still have friends in the industry like Keno, Naoshi Sano and others, and every now and again you may see him on their social media. He did apparently spend some time inside, although details on that aren't too clear. He at least seems smiley and in better shape from the couple of pics that do exist. However, it's not likely that we'll see him in a big company's ring again. A scandal like the one Morishima had is the sort of thing that follows you in the Japanese wrestling world for years, having a far greater impact than an equivalent scandal would in, say, the United States. In fact, it pretty much blacklists you, quite possibly forever. And so he is still quite likely to be out of wrestling completely for a long time to come. The fall of Morishima is, honestly, one of the saddest things I've had to look at when it comes to pro wrestling. It kinda shows just what the system and the business can do to someone, and how hard it can be for people to break out of that, especially when it comes to an end all of a sudden. Morishima is 41 years old at the time of writing this. For comparison's sake, that's the same age as Samoa Joe. In an ideal world, he would still be active in the ring, but now most people think that we may never hear his name again. A crying shame for someone who was a big star. But then, as Hisami pointed out at the end of her article, the star factor was one of the big problems. Again, Morishima could have happily carved out a living in the system. If he were a trainer, he'd have had a place to live, a lifestyle he was accustomed to, a network of friends and contacts, all sorts. For better or worse, a lot of people in Japanese wrestling never leave its highly regimented life, and for Morishima, that may have been for the best. Alas, he instead went down a path that resulted in a tragic isolation and degradation of his already fragile mental state. To see a champion like himself fall is never not sad, but for them to fall to the state of being regarded as little more than a bum, it's hard to take. There may well perhaps be holes in this story, things that we may well never know. It's hard not to think like that, especially in current times, but we simply don't know. And if we do never hear his name again, well, all we can do is look back. The delirium of that brawl against Samoa Joe, the shock of his title victory against Homicide, the jaw-dropping savagery of the classic with Danielson. The well-earned victory against one of the greatest of all time that led him through any physical barriers that may have stood in his way to the top of the mountain. Look back and remember him this way. Bye for now.